Afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the IS, I'd like to welcome you to the GHG Coordination Working Group meeting on the accounting and reporting approach to discuss the draft final proposal, which was posted last Friday. My name is Elena Coppola-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating a web conference today. I'm joined by Anya Gilbert, Sylvie Spivak, and Milos Vasanas from the policy team. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that these materials, this presentation, and the proposal are available on the Greenhouse Gas Coordination Initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com, navigating to the Stakeholder Center tab at the top, selecting Policy Initiatives, and that'll take you to our main initiatives landing page, and from there you can navigate to the GHG Coordination page, and these links will be toward the top. A few housekeeping reminders before we get started. The call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, but please keep your comments professional and respectful as always. And please try to be brief and refrain from repeating what's already been said so we can manage our time efficiently today. So raise your hand. Please open the participant and chat panels from the bottom right of your screen. And the raise hand icon is nestled in at the bottom of the participant panel. If you connected outside of the WebEx, you can press *3 to get into the question queue. And however you ask your question, just remember to say your name and affiliation before making your comment. If you send questions in the chat, you can send them to all panelists, so we'll see them all together. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. Until our events, today's event producer is Ahmed. Here's where we are in the stakeholder process. We just published a draft final proposal. We are going to be reviewing that today. From here, I'm going to hand it over to Anya to go over each of the sections of this draft final proposal.
All right, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. Maybe before we get started, I wanted to thank you all for your comments on the straw proposal, but also give thanks to the GHG subgroup, which was a group of volunteers from this working group. They've been helping to develop this accounting and reporting approach when it comes to the policy and details in bi-weekly meetings. And I really want to thank them for their time and effort in helping shape this to date. So as Yelena mentioned, my presentation today is going to be providing an overview of the accounting and reporting approach and the draft final proposal that we posted last Friday. Along with posting the presentation, we have that draft final proposal paper, and we also have an Excel workbook that I'll be discussing at the end of today's presentation. And maybe before we move to the next slide, I just wanted to flag where we are in the process. We are close to the end of the policy process, but I do really want to emphasize that we're still looking for your feedback on this draft final proposal in order to shape the final proposal. And you'll have about a month to provide feedback. We're requesting comments from stakeholders if you have comments by August 20th. And I'm happy to meet with you or your teams in the next 3 weeks if there's concepts that you'd like to discuss further. So let's move to the next slide. Oh, can we go back a slide? There we go, great. So to center us, I thought I'd remind the working group of what problem we're trying to solve based on the problem statement that this working group developed. And there are many subparts to the problem statement, but at its core, the problem statement recognized that the ISOs market doesn't currently have a way to reflect state or local climate policies that, unlike a cap and trade or cap and invest program, do not put a cost on carbon on generating resources. And the challenge in reflecting these, I'll call them non-price-based policies, coupled with the challenge of the existing data the CAISO produces, doesn't allow an entity to show progress towards its climate goals, even if it has increased its clean energy procurement. And that's created the need for a new solution. And what the Western Power Trading Forum, or WPTF, proposed to this working group was, in short, a transparency measure. And what this approach does is overlays a reporting entity's ownership and contracted data for resources that they've engaged in contracts with, along with market dispatch, to produce a residual rate data set that allows reporting entities to see and understand the emissions intensity of their portfolio. And the data that will be produced really relates to the real-time dispatch of resources across the WEAM and EDAM footprint. I'll note early on that we're going to use a lot of terms in this presentation that we don't use typically in market design. You can find these terms in the glossary of this deck or at the end of the draft final proposal, but I want to spend a moment on 3 of those terms. Throughout this presentation, when we talk about a reporting entity, it represents a market participant that chooses to have this report developed. This could include a load serving entity, an independent power producer, a federal power market entity, or a BAA, just to name a few examples. But this reporting entity does need to have a market participating resource or tie to the market. And when we talk about allocation in this context, it's really about how the dispatched megawatts and emissions are assigned and where they're assigned. This is very different than the term attribution, which is a term that we use somewhat synonymous with the GHG award that's related to the in-market design. And then lastly, we'll be talking about the residual rate data set that's being produced, and that encompasses the megawatts and associated emissions that reflect the unowned, uncontracted, or are otherwise allocated to this residual rate data set as a result of a reporting entity's excess energy. In terms of what this approach is seeking to do, it is intended to support market participants that are operating under state, local, or corporate climate commitments that are not based on a cost of carbon. And as many of you are aware, wholesale markets are able to reflect costs and constraints to inform dispatch. And this approach does neither. It's a transparency measure. And there were various objectives of this report in the WPTF proposal that the working group supported. These goals or objectives are further documented in the draft final proposal, but I think it's helpful to have these in the back of our mind as we review the draft final proposal, and so you can start assessing to what extent are we landing at a proposal that helps balance these objectives. And that included standardized tracking over time, accurately assigning the energy and associated emissions, more precisely accounting for transfers to a non-greenhouse gas regulation area. Another goal of the report is that it would accommodate different approaches for accounting for clean energy, whether that was for state requirements or for corporate goals. And then one of the key benefits or goals was that this not impose on non-greenhouse gas regions. And this was a key benefit stated by proponents in terms of it was out of market and thus didn't impact the optimization or kind of dispatch or costs to market participants. In terms of what the approach achieves, it is a load-based approach whereby reporting entities can use this report to demonstrate how a combination of their ownership and contracting decisions along with market dispatch resulted in a given emissions inventory of what served their load if they have load. And if we look at the calculation is, in short, comparing dispatch to load to understand if a reporting entity had excess and if that excess then should be allocated to the residual rate data set, or if it had a shortfall, meaning in an hourly interval, if we compare dispatch to load and load was higher than its portfolio generation, those excess megawatt hours and associated emissions, if load is higher, we are adding in the megawatts and associated emissions at the residual rate. The calculation also accounts for two things. First, that if an entity had a resource that had megawatt hours that were attributed to a GHG pricing region, it reflects the fact that those megawatt hours were never intended to serve their own report and served another GHG pricing region, not the entity's own load. And it recognizes the greenhouse gas pricing overlay to the design and allows reporting entities that are in a GHG pricing region to share excess when other reporting entities in that price-based region have a shortfall. Something I would like to call out as a change to the formula since we last spoke and since you last saw the straw proposal is that this formula no longer includes the concept of voluntary climate region. And just as a quick refresher and background on that, the concept of the voluntary climate region was a self-defined set of reporting entities that elected to share excess megawatt hours and those associated emissions with other reporting entities that also had shortfall or excess in the same market interval. This was modeled off of the ability for reporting entities in a price region to share excess generation with each other if they were in shortfall. And the goal of the voluntary climate region was to link like-minded climate policies that weren't subject to carbon prices, but these entities had similar investments into carbon reduction. This approach did impact the megawatt hours and emissions that were reflected in the residual data set. In comments received, there is limited support for this approach. And so moving forward, the approach is going to start with a simplified approach without the voluntary climate region. That being said, with operational experience with this report, we can continue to assess the need of including this option in the future if that becomes needed or necessary. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide unless we have any questions. Not seeing any. Throughout this presentation, I will be calling out areas of state deference, but at a high level, we recognize that this process is moving faster than state or possible local regulations and want to provide this as an opportunity for regulators to flag areas where you may want to see more deference. But in short, this approach is really an informational tool. It's not intended to supplant or replace regulatory requirements, and it's ultimately going to be up to those regulators on if this data set meets their needs and if it can be used by market participants to support compliance. So with that, let's get into the report, and I'll start with the overall structure. Could we move to the next slide? Thanks. So there's three main elements of the report: registration, calculation, and data publication. The registration is meant to be ongoing, and the goal of registration, and I'll be spending a number of slides talking about what this means and the data we'll be collecting, but its goal is to understand and assign who owns what when, and to collect an understanding from the ISO on resource assumptions. What is the ownership arrangement? Can we confirm if there is contracting that contract took place? If there are shared resources, to understand the assumptions for those shared resources in terms of how megawatt hours and emissions should be allocated based on shared contract assumptions. It's meant to collect information on excess energy, as well as other information related to null power. So that represents a resource that does not have a REC associated with it. Out-of-market purchases and WEM non-participating resources. This reflects two categories of resources where the ISO doesn't have data on the dispatch information, and it will be optional to include. I'll talk about that more later. We'll be collecting information on the emission factors that should be used for this approach. And depending on the type of reporting entity, we may need to also collect load information at an hourly level. The calculation phase has the objective of totaling what's associated with the report versus the residual rate. And the data publication phase is really around providing transparency through a public report and the opportunity to have a private report. And we'll talk about those more at the end. Next slide. So these are some of the attributes of the resource information that we'll be collecting on an ongoing basis. Let's move to the next slide. Let's start with the reporting entity. And as I mentioned earlier, a reporting entity is any market participant that elects to have a report produced using the accounting and reporting approach. So this is voluntary, this is opt-in, but each reporting entity is going to have to register in order to be identified as a reporting entity using this approach. Next slide. The other element is going to be the region. So the reporting entity is going to share with the ISO if the entity is in a greenhouse gas pricing region, so that we know if the reporting entity is subject to California's cap and trade program or Washington's cap and invest program. That also really allows for the report to allow sharing of excess or shortfall between reporting entities in the price-based regions. And that is why we are collecting information on the region, in particular with the emphasis on which GHG price region. Next slide. The next step is what resources should be associated with this reporting entity's account. So the reporting entity is going to convey what owned and contracted resources should be associated. Let's move to the next slide. And there's two aspects to shared resources: the confirmation of ownership, and next I'll be talking about the dispatch assumptions associated with shared resources. But a question that you saw peppered throughout various stages of this initiative have been how to ensure that two parties that have a kind of shared ownership of a resource, how they confirm if yes, these megawatts that were sold but were purchased by this other entity. And this is really to ensure that there's not double counting by multiple parties. And there are different ways to approach it. And in some ways, some of the feedback that we've been looking for has been more of an implementation detail of should that be an in-application confirmation or a blanket attestation. And some of the stakeholder perspectives we received on this included some support for the blanket attestation, and that could involve something like a reporting entity saying, everything I'm reporting and conveying as mine is true and accurate. The other option that we had was an in-application confirmation, and at least from comments, it sounded like there was a leaning towards support of that from Bonneville and WPTF. And entities that were open to either approach included the Arizona Utilities, PGP, WPTF, and Singularity provided the perspective that the approach doesn't matter so long as there's resolution. And what resonated with me about that is, in some ways, we don't know the ultimate IT solution for this policy process. If it could, on one bookend approach be a data upload, on another bookend approach have more of a sophisticated user interface design. And so ahead of understanding what implementation will look like, it does feel premature to dictate exactly what the confirmation approach will look like. And instead, the approach simply dictates that there will be an opportunity to confirm these transacted megawatts for use in the report, but To the extent that any megawatt hours are unconfirmed, meaning one of the parties has not provided an affirmative statement that, yes, this transaction has occurred, or that this represents the true and accurate accounting of this transaction, those unconfirmed megawatts are going to be identified as unconfirmed in public reports and in the private report. The public report is going to include the total megawatt hours and the associated emissions of all unconfirmed megawatts on an hourly basis. But the private report for an entity will only include the megawatt hours, really to avoid potential confidentiality issues. You can imagine a scenario where an entity says, I have only entered into agreement with this one resource, and then if the CAISO is providing that entity with the emissions information, that could represent confidential information. And so we will not represent the emissions information for those unconfirmed megawatts in the private report, but it will be aggregated in the public report. Pause and see if there's any questions. All right, seeing none, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. The other aspect of shared resources has to do with the allocation between reporting entities. So what this attempts to do is outline, based on different shared assumptions, how will the CAISO take that dispatch information and assign it to various entities. And so what the CAISO has done in the draft final proposal is provided two examples of how this allocation could be done between reporting entities. And this is an area where throughout this process, we have been asking if there are other constructs for shared contracts that we should be aware of. And I will ask that question again as an opening if there are other permutations we should consider. But on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is a scenario where two entities share the capacity of a resource, and the allocation should be based on a percentage of energy dispatch. And in this scenario, the capacity assignment for each is a 50% allocation for this 100 megawatt resource. And in the example for the energy assignment, we recognize that while the capacity is 100, energy dispatch won't always be 100. And so when the resource receives a 60 megawatt hour award and metered performance reflects 60 megawatt hours, how should that be assigned? And so with this percent allocation, if it's a 50-50 shared resource, this would take those 60 megawatt hours and divide that equally between entity A and entity B. The other scenario on the right-hand side takes a different perspective, where it is really more of a fixed megawatt share applied to one entity and a remainder goes to the other. So in this example, again, we have a 100 megawatt resource, but the contract assumptions in this scenario are that entity A always receives the first megawatt hours of dispatch, and entity B is always allocated any remainder of that dispatch. So in this case, if the award is 60 megawatt hours and the metered performance shows 60 megawatt hours of response, it's entity A that's getting those first 50 megawatt hours, and entity B is getting those remaining 10 megawatt hours and the associated emissions corresponding with that dispatch. Again, if there's other scenarios we should consider, please let us know. I also want to note for the attribution overlay, if there was also attribution of these resources, we are going to assume the same attribution kind of approach. And that's something we've been asking the last few papers, and I haven't heard any feedback that it should be reflected otherwise. But if we kind of take that approach with the second example, this would mean that if this entity received 60 megawatt hours of energy dispatch and 60 megawatt hours of a GHG award, the entity A would get kind of that energy dispatch, but also those 50 megawatts of GHG attribution, and entity B both gets those 10 megawatt hours of energy and GHG attribution. That's important because if this is to a priced region, that is then netted out of their approach because those megawatt hours were really serving another GHG pricing region and not their own load. Next slide. This next section is going to discuss the excess energy option. And you can think of this as during periods of excess, what methodology should be used to assign emissions and the megawatt hours to a reporting entity versus what should be considered excess and go into the residual data set. I think it's important to understand that the excess energy option a given reporting entity chooses does ultimately impact the residual rate data set, and that is really underpinned by the methodology. So in feedback received on the straw proposal, there were various perspectives on this excess energy option and the ability to have 3 different methodologies to choose between. We're also introducing a 4th option in the draft final proposal, but that included the 3 proposals in the straw proposal included an average, a merit order or least cost dispatch approach, and a user choice approach. Under the average approach, PacifiCorp suggested to only allow the average for all reporting entities across the CAISO's footprint. We heard from San Diego Gas and Electric to only allow merit order, and we heard from the Arizona utilities to disallow user choice. The overwhelming feedback was to preserve the flexibility of what approach is used to meet different state requirements and allow for flexibility for those entities. One kind of caveat to that flexibility and support was from Singularity, who commented that potentially there should be RPS exceptions, meaning if there were RPS resources, those resources should always be assigned to the reporting entity. And the approach the draft final proposal takes is to maintain that flexibility, and it does defer to states on if they're going to direct their market participants to use a certain excess energy option, but also allows the provision of a new methodology if the state comes up with their own. The approach in terms of how long a reporting entity needs to maintain a given excess energy option defaults to 1 year in order to have a minimum requirement there. Next slide. So this is more of a visual of what the excess energy option could mean or could look like based on a single market interval for a reporting entity. And I'll just run through this quickly. We've gone through this in prior meetings, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing is 100 megawatts of load for a given hourly interval. But this reporting entity's resource mix is comprised of 50 megawatts of solar, 60 megawatts of hydro, and 40 megawatts of gas that were dispatched. And this is their metered performance for what they owned and contracted for in that interval. So because this is a load-based approach looking at what the megawatt hours and emissions their load was responsible for, we are only assigning 100 megawatt hours to their load. And so the question is, what should be the approach for those excess 50 megawatts in terms of how that's assigned to either the pricing region or to the residual rate? And the approach is included in a kind of weighted average. And in the average approach, that could either be allocated to the pricing region or to the residual rate data set. I do want to clarify that in the straw proposal, we position this as an either or. For average on all of the approaches, there will be flexibility on that assignment. And then for the merit order approach, it really is stacking the resources based on least cost based on the energy and GHG bid. And so you're seeing the solar kind of being assigned first to the reporting entity, and then the hydro, and then the remaining hydro and gas is assigned to the GHG pricing region under the premise that this entity is in a pricing region. And then for user choice, the entity is able to provide the CAISO a ranked order choice of what resources should be associated with their reporting entity first. And then we take that ranked order list and kind of cut off above their load and are able to assign between either the GHG pricing region or allocate to the residual data set. So again, this report maintains the flexibility to choose a given option that's maintained for 1 year. And let's go to the next slide for the newest update to that. And apologies, we had some additional slides added, so this is referencing the incorrect slide, but it's really meant to be the reference the slide before this. But just recognizing that if a state regulatory agency does mandate a given methodology that isn't covered in the options that we presented, the reporting entity can submit that methodology for use for this report to determine how excess energy is either assigned to the reporting entity or allocated to the residual data set. So providing that flexibility, just recognizing that this approach is moving faster than state regulations, and some states might develop their own methodology in the future. Next slide. This next section refers to null power, again, renewable generation that's no longer bundled with its renewable energy credit. And there is a recognition that states across the West approach null power differently. And I'll frame that as, some states, such as Washington, view not addressing null power as resulting in double counting, and that it could undermine some market participant state compliance. Whereas other states, such as Oregon, have regulations that do not require accommodations for null power. And what we heard in comments and these stakeholder perspectives was kind of one perspective that null power accounting considerations should be included. That included Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, the Washington Department of Commerce, Public Generating Pool, and apologize, CRS should have also been included here. There was also a perspective not to accommodate REC or null power as it's a separate accounting approach, and that perspective came from CARB, Nevada, PacifiCorp, Portland, and the Oregon agencies. And then we heard an additional caveat to that from the Oregon agencies. That was to say, at least provide data in a format that allows a state to individually decide how to treat null power. And what you'll see in the draft final proposal approach is a requirement for null power reporting for all entities. But the final report presents the residual rate data set to include hourly data with and without null power in order to accommodate the Oregon and Washington regulatory approaches. So you'll see that once we move to that Excel workbook at the end. Next slide. The next aspect of this report is related to information that the CAISO doesn't have, but is related to megawatt hours and emissions that serve a reporting entity's load. And that includes out-of-market purchases, which would be a purchase from a resource that's not located in either a WEIM or EDAM balancing authority area. And it also includes a WEIM non-participating resource. And this would be a resource that's in a WEIM balancing authority area, but it's not participating in the real-time market. And these are categories of resources where we don't have the dispatch information for either of these type of resources. And what I've been hearing in comments, and when we have this conversation, is more of a philosophical divide on if the accounting and reporting approach should reflect the megawatt hours and emissions a reporting entity is responsible for in total versus just responsible for in the ISO's footprint. And so what we heard in comments from some states were some concerns about the accuracy of the data reported outside the ISO's jurisdiction and its impact on the residual rate. Heard more of an implementation feedback item from WPTF, recognizing that if it was a big implementation burden that it could be added in later by the reporting entity. They did agree that it could impact the residual rate data set, and most stakeholders recommended including it. The draft final proposal does make it optional to include based on state requirements, but it will be called out in the inputs and assumptions section of the private report. That way, when someone picks up a private report or if it's shared with a state regulator, it's clear on if this report does or doesn't include either out-of-market purchases or WEIM non-participating resources. We do recognize that some states take other approaches to collecting this information. Next slide. This next section is on load data. So in order to compare dispatch information to load, reporting entities are going to need to provide the ISO with hourly load data. And if the reporting entity is partially in a GHG pricing region, this load is going to need to be provided separately. We don't believe that this will need to apply for reporting entities that are also balancing authority areas, but in recognition that the ISO views and receives load information for BAAs, but not other disaggregated portions of BAAs, like for a load serving entity within a BAA. That is an example of information where we don't have it. And in order to produce this report, we would need to be provided that load data in order to compare it with dispatch information and produce this report. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So this next section is about the calculation phase related to the emission factor default assumptions we'll use and assumptions we'll make for different fuel types. Let's move to the next slide. One of the challenges with developing this approach and producing this data is, at least today, the ISO largely only has emission factors for California resources. And so throughout this process, we've requested feedback on some of the default assumptions to take for emission factors. And stakeholders have had mixed responses on what those defaults should be. So the approach the draft final proposal is going to take is to have a business practice manual, or BPM, update to require all market participants to include their emission factors for their resources in the master file for use in the accounting and reporting approach. And the hierarchy of determining emission factors will really be based on pulling it from the master file. If that's not available, we'll use EIA or EPA data. And if that's not available, it will be calculated by the ISO using kind of the best available information and methodologies at that time. Next slide. There are also various considerations for various technology types and how we would treat them based on this technology or fuel type. So for fuel-based generation, we have certain information. And for the accounting and reporting approach, our approach will be to use the master file assigned emission factor. And as I mentioned, if that's not available, we can use publicly available EIA or EPA information. And if that's not available, calculate it. For intermittent renewable generation, we receive the fuel type information and we'll report that as zero emitting. For hydro resources, there are various participation models that are used. And the treatment will include, the option to even treat it as standalone storage, treat it as zero emitting, or to treat it as self-reported. So giving some flexibility there, given that there are various participation models and ways to represent hydro resources. The newest change to the draft final proposal had to do with how we treat storage, hybrid, and co-located resources. In comments received, both WPTF and Singularity had some suggestions. WPTF recommended to ensure that we have an approach that might look at storage more as a source rather than load. So the straw proposal reflected storage and hybrid and co-located largely as a load adjustment. The feedback from WPTF was that there could be some reporting entities like independent power producers that do not have load. And so to also consider an approach by which we would kind of recognize that they don't have load and treat them more like a supply resource. So for storage, we do receive the participation model, and the approach that we are going to take and is reflected in the draft final proposal is to treat storage as a load adjustment for reporting entities with load, or if they don't have load, the storage resources will charge at the residual rate for that hourly interval. For a hybrid resource, and this hybrid resource really reflects when we recognize that we only see one data point at that point of interconnection, but it might be two resources, but we model it as one resource. But the resource components could include storage and other generating components. And so we will use the fuel assumptions associated with the non-storage resource components when charging. Otherwise, we're going to treat it as a load adjustment when they have load, or allow it to charge at a residual rate if they do not have load. Co-located resources, we model as two separate resources, and there's a feature called the off-grid charge indicator that indicates when this resource cannot charge from the grid. And that is really in light of sometimes ITC reasons, investment tax credit reasons, whereby this resource has received funding, but has requirements that they must charge from their on-site resource. So when we have this indicator that they cannot charge from the grid, we will treat it as a hybrid resource and use the fuel assumptions associated with the non-storage resource emission factor. Otherwise, we'll treat it as a load adjustment if the reporting entity has load, or it will charge at the residual rate if it does not have load. For demand response, we have various participation models to reflect DR as supply, whether it's reflected as a supply resource using one of our DR market models, or if it is a load modifying resource, we're going to be treating it as a load adjustment for all participation models, whether it is in market or out of market. Next slide. All right, now we're on to the data publication aspect of the report. I will be shortly sharing an Excel workbook that was posted last Friday as well to review the data elements that are in the public report, and this includes a fuel type report where we are going to be publishing the hourly aggregated volumes and the associated emissions for the entire market footprint. This data does include null power in the respective fuel category, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. We have a residual data set report, and this was really the key ask associated with developing the accounting and reporting approach. And what it does is it reflects hourly volumes and the emissions by fuel type, or for all resources that are in the residual rate data set, and it separates out null power and unconfirmed megawatts. And then we have a null power report that has quarterly and annual volumes of null power by fuel type. And then we have an excess energy option report. So it essentially aggregates the megawatt hours associated with which excess energy option a reporting entity selected. And the objective of having this report is for regulators to understand if they are seeing material changes to the residual data set, could one of the drivers be the excess energy option chosen? And by seeing the volumes for each of the reporting options, that might be an underlying indicator of why that residual data set is changing. We will also be providing private reports to entities that are using the report. This is a reflection of the registration information that was supplied to the ISO by the reporting entity, so that essentially the inputs and assumptions are known for someone that picks up the report if the reporting entity is providing this to a regulator or other entity. But in short, the private report will provide the megawatt hours and emissions broken down by the reporting entity's own fleet versus the residual rate data set. And some information will need to be collected from the reporting entity to understand how they want to reflect null power. And a big question I have is we may just need to report unconfirmed megawatts separately, as those could reflect double counting. And maybe more of an area of feedback I'm interested in from this group is how best to consider unconfirmed megawatts in that private report. So with that, I'll pause for questions. And I think we can move to the section of the presentation that's going to review some of the publicly reported data elements in the Excel workbook. I just wanted to see if there's any comments from some of the participants on the line.
Yeah, Anya, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or any hands in the floor.
Okay, well, if I can be given presentation rights, I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. So this Excel workbook was uploaded, and it has a first tab that has, sorry, I'm going to pause for a moment. A question came in on chat. There was a question that came in chat that I just want to pause and take before we move on. It was a question about the shared resource allocation and if both options would be available. Yes, both options will be available. My key question for the broader working group is, are there other permutations of shared contract arrangements that are not covered by those two options that we should include in the final proposal? So just to reconfirm, both options discussed on slide 14 for shared resource allocations, both will be allowed. Please let me know if there's other contractual arrangements that should be considered. Thank you. And then there was a question about the CARB comments. Are those public and posted? I might need to check with our stakeholder affairs team. They were submitted, and I think we're working through getting them posted. So bear with us on that front.
Yeah, they should be available on the page now.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. All right, well, turning back to our Excel workbook. So you'll see a summary of what each of the reports does and a key for some of the headings. But let me first move to the fuel report, just to give folks a sense. And again, The reason we are producing this and publishing this data workbook is not a reflection of necessarily what the final report will look and feel like. It could be a data download. It could be an in-application visualization of this data. It could be publicly posted on our website, like with Outlook today. But I do want to give a sense of how the data is reflected to understand if there are concerns. And this is because the key product of the accounting and reporting approach is the data it produces for that transparency. So the fuel report shows on an hourly basis. So we have our fuel type, our trade date, our trade hour, and it shows the total megawatt hours by fuel type and the total metric tons. I haven't populated this for every fuel type, but I am using this as an indicator that this is the information that would be populated based on dispatch information. And this would represent the entire WEIM and EDM footprint based on the dispatch and the self-reported WEM non-participating resources and out-of-market purchases to the extent that they are reported. Just pause and see if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'll move to the residual data set tab. This one takes a little bit of time to talk through, but again, for each trade date and trade hour, we were reporting 3 numbers. And they are the total generation of what was dispatched in that hour. However, separately and not to be added are the unconfirmed megawatts. So again, in that example where 2 reporting entities have entered into an agreement and essentially entity A has sold entity B 1,000 megawatts and it was dispatched for 1,000 megawatt hours. If one of the entities didn't, if the selling entity didn't sign off and say, yes, I sold those megawatt hours in a short-term capacity sale to this other entity, they will be listed as unconfirmed because we don't know if this represents double counting or not. And there is a potential that both reporting entities could be reporting this. We're looking to have measures in place to allow these megawatt hours to be confirmed, but absent that, they will be listed as unconfirmed. And then separately, we are reporting out the total null power volumes. So again, this is not additive, but if you had an example where you had 100 megawatts of a solar resource that was null power, it would not, those 100, and let's actually use 200 since it says 200, those 200 megawatts would not be included in the generation line item. They would only be reported in this null row over here. So again, these aren't necessarily additive, but again, this is to allow for state flexibility in terms of their approach to null power, in terms of wanting to see what megawatt hours were null power or have them separately reported. And there is a separate line item for unconfirmed power, whereby both reporting entities or multiple have not signed off to say, yes, this does reflect the transaction that occurred. And again, that's to prevent double counting. Pause for a second if there's any questions with this residual data set tab. But again, for every trade hour, there's a generation line, unconfirmed line, and null power line, and they're not necessarily considered additive. All right, not seeing any hands. The null power report is really a total of the null power volume produced in a year and by quarter, and then also broken out by fuel type. That had been a request for us to include in the report. And then the final tab is the excess energy option reported. Again, this might be one of the drivers for why entities might be seeing changes to the total emissions in the residual data set tab. And what this section of the report does is total the gigawatt hours and it indicates the number of reporting entities that are using a given excess energy option. I have not included the regulator choice here because this hasn't started and we don't have a regulator choice option. That's just optionality given in the future. But for the sake of this example, it's just the gigawatt hours and the number of reporting entities that are using a given excess energy option. And again, we're giving flexibility to choose which approach is taken, and we're giving flexibility to change that approach the following year if needed. So I'll pause for a moment and see if there are any questions. I'm happy to meet with you and your teams if it would be helpful in order to review any aspect to the report or some of the public report. Again, we are looking for your feedback in ways that we could improve the final proposal and the ultimate data set. All right, well, I think with that, we can move to the next slide. And again, just a reminder that comments are due on August 20th, and we are looking to publish a final proposal on September 1st. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Yelena, and thank you everyone for your participation and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. Let's go to the next slide, please. Good. We've included these couple slides so you will know what's going on and are able to be better engaged or more closely engaged in what's going on each week at the ISO. So we have our stakeholder meetings and our submission deadlines and trainings listed here. Next slide, please. As well as market sim information, a link to the release schedule, VPM updates, our news releases, and any outage information we have for the week. Next slide, please. And then here we have a new Energy Matters blog that was posted on July 16th, highlighting how the Regional Issue Forum, the continued work supporting further stakeholder engagement, elevating sector perspectives, and preparing for alignment with our governance reforms. Over the past decade, the RIF has evolved into a vital part of market governance. Now, with EDAM on the horizon and governance reforms under discussion, the RIF is proposing enhancements to ensure stakeholders remain deeply engaged and heard. So you can read the full blog and learn how the RIF is preparing for the future and how you can stay involved. And on behalf of Stakeholder Affairs, I want to thank Anya for today's presentation and thank you for your questions in the chat. And I'd like to thank Ahmed, our event producer, for his support. We will post the recording of this to the initiative page in a few business days. And thank you for joining us. Ahmed, you may conclude the call.
The event has concluded. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.